Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything happening in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going through Jeddah. This was a race that was very exciting all the way from qualifying to the end, and it's also a race that really felt like things were shifting in terms of which teams are actually competitive this year. As always, we'll run through what happened before the race that was important to know, key moments from the race itself, and of course, we'll get into your questions and hot takes from the race, as well as your predictions and mine for both Miami and the rest of the season. And this was a pretty packed race, so we're going to jump right in. Before the race, we of course had practice sessions and qualifying, but one of the things that I think was an interesting point out from the practice sessions was not only the fact that the McLarens were of course pacing very quickly, but also we are continuing to see Pierre Gasly in the Alpine show out a good performance. Obviously, we have some things to talk about when it comes to his race itself, but when we look at Pierre specifically for the last 2 weeks, a team that we're typically looking at as a back marker on the grid with Alpine is starting to have some pretty strong performance from Pierre specifically. Last week, we saw a very strong qualifying from him, and we saw the same again this week. And we're not seeing the same performance from his teammate, Jack Doohan, which makes a couple of questions start to pop up when it comes to Jack himself, because Jack waited for this seat for so long, kind of in the wings at Alpine and running as a reserve driver for so long, even showing up a little bit as a correspondent for F1 TV, and really being a part of helping build this team and the car. But it's starting to bring up some questions when we're seeing Pierre bring so much more performance out of that car. Even though Alpine themselves are not at the top of the grid and they're not a team that is necessarily fighting for the championship spot, it is going to raise the same types of questions we see when we're talking about Max Verstappen and his teammate, or the head-to-head of Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari. When there is such a large gap between your first driver and your second, it starts to become a question of whether or not there is a better option in that second driver, and he's one of 4 drivers that still has not scored points. So this is sort of a point that I guess is both in qualifying and in practice, but Pierre is extracting a lot of performance out of this car. But even with that performance and the points that he has scored, Alpine is running 9th in the Constructors' Championship. And the question is going to start to become, especially for a team that has as many young, talented reserve drivers as Alpine does, especially with a driver like Franco Colapinto among those numbers, how much more highlighted is Jack's performance when you're seeing his teammate really perform so much further ahead? And with Pierre, to some degree, pre-race, really exceeding the expectations of a team like Alpine and a car like Alpine's. And something I started to question watching free practice and qualifying this week is the Alpine actually a lot better than we think it is? Because when we see Pierre jumping up like this, it really does start to make you wonder, is he so much more overperforming, or is Jack really underperforming? So, just to start the episode out on an ominous note, if Jack can't catch up or at least start to close the gap, is there a better driver suited to that second seat? Or is Pierre really just finding a sweet spot with this car? Because I am curious, as we get into that kind of best of the rest situation, do we see Alpine make a change? Or do we see Jack start to perform better? Outside of Alpine, of course, we had a couple of other big moments in qualifying. One team to look at in particular is Williams, and this head-to-head shift between Carlos and Alex. We saw Alex Albon really come out of the gate strong this season and outperform Carlos by a significant degree, but over the last 2 weeks, we are starting to see Carlos get really comfortable with the car and extract a little bit more of that performance, and he himself said that this was the first week that he felt he was truly competitive. And this week, we actually see Alex get knocked out in Q2, and Carlos make it all the way to P6 in Q3. However, another thing to point out is how close the field was this week and how close those lap times were, because even though Carlos ended up qualifying P6 and Alex got knocked out in Q2, putting him at P11, in Q2 their times were actually less than 1/10 of a second apart. So even though there was a large gap in qualifying between the two of them and where they placed, that actual time gap in their lap time in Q2 was actually a little bit less significant than it seemed like, but nevertheless we're starting to see both of them perform very well, and especially after the disappointment for them last week, it's an interesting thing to see them both performing a little bit better and for Carlos to be getting his feet underneath him at Williams. Then of course at the top of Q3, at the point that Oscar was the only driver who had put a lap time in, we see Lando go into the barriers. This was in particular kind of devastating because we were seeing Lando really perform well in practice sessions and in Q1 and Q2, and he had been outpacing Oscar previously. Lando in that car was really fast this week, and it was just a stupid mistake that sent him into the wall, which ultimately really did affect his race weekend. And of course, as we'll get to towards the end of this episode, heavily affected his current driver standings. The timing of that crash also gave his teammate Oscar a little bit of an advantage, given that Oscar was the only driver in the session that had actually put a time up when Lando crashed and the red flag came out. It was also just like barely there. He very barely crossed the line before the red flag was called, which allowed that time to actually count. Obviously, everybody still put in times after the red flag, and we did still see the rest of that qualifying session, but there is a level of comfort in knowing that you already have a time on the board and nobody else does. And this crash from Lando really is such a shame because I think we were seeing the performance adjust from last week. We were seeing him really really actually hook those laps up, and I think qualifying, there was a real chance that he may have been on pole had he not made that mistake. They were able to rebuild the car and he was still able to participate, and he wasn't starting all the way back from the back of the field, he was just starting in 10th. Nevertheless, obviously, the more that you can eliminate mistakes that are just your own mistakes, the better that you're going to fare in a championship and race setting. So it was quite unfortunate to see Lando go out the way that he did, and I think it gave everybody a little bit more breathing room and confidence at the front of the field. Because instead of having to battle two McLarens, whether that had been a 1-2 or a 1-2-3 with Max in between them, there is only one McLaren that everyone had to be worried about at the top. And Lando ultimately was focusing his race on having to cut through the field from 10th. Had Lando actually finished the session, it's most likely he would have either qualified on pole or at least within the top 3. And again, that would have changed everyone's race strategy. So things like this are always so frustrating because it's an unforced error, meaning it's not a racing incident. It's not something where another driver got in Lando's way. It was just ultimately a mistake on his end that was a very costly one. But without a doubt, heading into the race from practice and qualifying, the McLarens were in fact the fastest cars on track. It may depend on which driver you ask about that, but lap time wise, absolutely they were the fastest. Then I also want to point out that Yuki again took the car into Q3, and again we'll get into the race itself, but from the qualifying perspective, we're continuing to see him prove that he wanted that seat and that he can perform in it. Then to close out qualifying, we see Max take pole by a small margin over Oscar. Right behind Oscar is George Russell. Charles Leclerc closes out that second row, and then we have Kimi Antonelli, Carlos Sainz, Lewis Hamilton, Yuki Tsunoda, Pierre Gasly, and Lando Norris close out your top 10. Then one other low moment from qualifying, Isaac Hadjar takes P14, which is his lowest qualifying position for his F1 career so far. So we've covered qualifying, leading up to the race and everything like that. Let's get into the race itself. Jeddah is not only a high-speed track, but it's also a track with a number of turns. We had a lot of overtaking, a lot of fun, and a lot of movement throughout the entire race. So we may not go through everything lap by lap or point by point, but we are going to cover the highlights and the moments that matter for the future. Right off the bat, we had a very eventful start. At the front of the field, we have Max, Oscar, and George getting off the line. And we do see Oscar make a play for that lead position by the first turn. And this moment was a moment that defined the rest of the race. Max is coming in strong at the turn and ends up leaving the track to maintain his own position. Oscar says that he leaves the track to gain position and has to hand it back. Max says that he was forced off the track by Oscar and that it was a dangerous move. But instead of having an opportunity to decide if he should hand the position back or if he should actually just wait and see if he's going to get a penalty, which is normally what we would see in this type of scenario when the race is going smoothly, we'll hear the kind of radio back and forth of should we give the position back preemptively or should we wait and see because it's a pretty murky gray area. Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda take contact a little bit further down the field and both of them crash into the wall, resulting in a red flag. At the beginning of that incident, Yuki did look like he was going to be able to rejoin the actual race and Pierre was out of that race instantly. However, once we went under the safety car and everybody got back into the garage, it was clear that Yuki could not continue and he had to retire the car with damage. Now, the question of who was at fault in this crash, Pierre or Yuki, it really to me felt like a racing incident. At the beginning of a race, things can be quite hectic. We saw Pierre make a kind of risky move, Yuki tried to defend it, and ultimately that just ended up in neither of them giving space to the other. And one quick tap at these speeds really does result in kind of race-ending damage. I think when we heard Pierre and Yuki speak about it afterwards, it really was sort of a racing incident. It's unfortunate. Obviously, both of them were in point-grabbing positions this week, and obviously you never want this to happen, but ultimately there was no penalty given to either driver. And we get into a situation where you could try to assign fault, and you're always going to want to say that it was the other guy, it wasn't your fault. But I really think this is one of those scenarios where it's what we call a racing incident. Nobody made any sort of intentionally egregious move, and the damage was just caused by both drivers remaining aggressive and trying to maintain their position on track. That being said, both of them being out of the race was quite unfortunate for both of those drivers because, like we've been talking about, Yuki Tsunoda has really been trying to prove that he deserves this Red Bull second seat. And we have been seeing him kind of put down what he needs to put down in order to prove that. We've seen his lap times during qualifying coming in around the range that Red Bull's looking for, and we've also seen him 2 times in a row get the car all the way down to Q3. And last week we even saw him score points. Yuki has been kind of trending upwards, I would say, and in response to all of the pressure that comes in that Red Bull second seat, really hasn't been crumbling under the pressure, but instead performing. And so it's always unfortunate to see anyone not finish a race, but it was especially unfortunate given the trajectory that we've been seeing Yuki take. Obviously, I would have loved to have seen him actually finish the race and have another points finish, especially given the kind of excitement and pressure he has in terms of where he's going to be next year. Yuki's contract with Red Bull is over at the end of this season, and there's always a possibility that when Honda leaves, so will Yuki. However, given the stable of talent that Red Bull has right now, and the fact that one of the other junior drivers has already been perceived to have failed in this team, Yuki actually has this opening that we didn't think he would have, which is a possibility of actually staying at Red Bull in that second seat. And so the higher performance, the less mistakes, and the more that Yuki can finish these races in the points, points, the bigger the chance of Yuki staying on the grid next year. And I would also say, given the performance that we've seen from him just since he's moved into the Red Bull car, it would really be a shame to lose Yuki from the grid next year, because I think it's clear that he has a lot of potential and performance that we have never gotten a chance to see. And so we're actually really starting to see that now. He's in that top team, he's in that top seat, and it just sucks to see him retire from the race on that first lap. In a similar way, we have the Pierre situation, which, as I've talked about a little bit this episode, I really feel like Pierre has been pulling sudden performance out of this car. And to see him up in those top 10 slots with the potential of another points finish, again, it's one of those scenarios where you're like, both of these drivers could have had such an incredible race, and they also could have put pressure on other drivers throughout this race had they been able to finish. This crash and the timing of it was actually pretty important for the rest of the race, because the timing of it comes after this initial incident between Oscar and Max. And when they are under a red flag and the session is stopped, that's when the stewards are reviewing that incident. And so normally, if the race had continued on, we would have had a moment for Red Bull to determine whether or not they think that they should just have him hand the position back to Oscar and then attempt to overtake, which is a decision they would have made had they believed that they were getting a penalty, or to have actually seen the penalty handed down before that red flag would have happened. Both of those scenarios would have given Max a little bit more chance to actually recover from this incident. Regardless of the call and the call that was made, the timing of it makes it a little bit harder for him to deal with. And it also takes away a possible strategy call from Red Bull's side that could have changed the way that this race ended up. That 5-second penalty ends up being the detriment of Max's win, because in the end, without that 5-second penalty, it's most likely that Max would have still won the race. And so again, this is one of those what ifs that we keep coming to in this sport, and that Max himself has one of the most iconic lines about, which is if, it's always if. If my mom had balls, she'd be my dad. So again, I think there's this thing where it's like, okay, as an athlete, you probably aren't going to focus so much on this what if, because there's nothing you can do about it at this point. But at the same time, as fans, it's so hard not to do this what if. What if Red Bull had been able to make the decision to actually hand that position back? What if Yuki and Pierre hadn't crashed? What would that scenario have looked like, and would Max have won the race? But again, there's nothing we can do about it. We can just say and acknowledge that this 5-second penalty was a huge problem for Max's race overall. Once the race resumes and we're back on track, Max is given that 5-second penalty. And we do have a kind of funny moment on the radio where GP was clearly trying to get Max not to react, and Max drops an F-bomb anyway. As we all know, Max has been in a little bit of a battle with the FIA, especially when it comes to his comments on the radio and his language. And it was interesting to hear GP basically say, like, please don't comment, and then we get a comment and he goes, okay, great, yeah, no comment. And then throughout the race, we have a number of really interesting and strong stories from different teams. Despite Isaac's lowest qualifying position, we see him have a great race. He goes from qualifying 14th to making it into that final points position in 10th, and despite being out-qualified by his teammate Liam Lawson, he ultimately does finish 2 places ahead of him. In the end, Liam is still pointsless for this season. He had no points finishes in the Red Bull, and he still has not been able to finish in the points with the V-Carb. And what I worry about when it comes to Liam is that he has not seemed to be able to find his confidence. Obviously, starting out with such a rocky beginning of his season at Red Bull, not only not being able to bring the car to performance, but also being dropped down to the junior team with very little kind of time to prove himself, is obviously going to be a shake to the confidence. But I was also hoping we would see him move into a very different mentality with the V-Carb, that we would see pretty strong performance from him given that he's already familiar with that car from last year, that we would see him lock in mentally and physically and just kind of really be able to drive. It does feel like with his experience, he should be out driving Isaac, because even though we view them both as rookies, technically Liam has actually raced enough for V-Carb specifically that he's no longer considered a rookie. Not only did we see him take over races for injured drivers in the past, but we also saw him moved into a seat when Daniel Ricciardo was dropped last year. Liam should be really comfortable with this V-Carb. And even though we did see him out-qualify Isaac this week, he's being outdriven by his rookie teammate. And their head-to-head makes things look even worse, because you look at Isaac, who ultimately kind of feels like he is performing the best out of all of the rookies. While Kimi Antonelli is performing ahead of him in terms of points and in terms of finishes, we are seeing Isaac perform very well with a very different car. We have to remember that Kimi Antonelli is in a Mercedes, and that car is not only performing decently, but his teammate is actually actively podiuming. And ultimately, when you kind of account for the differences in machinery, we've seen Isaac perform pretty well up there, and Liam's not really matching that performance. I think the question really is, did his ego and his confidence really get knocked to the point that he can't recover after being dropped from Red Bull? And if that's the case, does it mean it would have been a better decision to leave him there and try to develop him? Or will he at some point lock back in this junior team position with less pressure? It's really interesting to kind of compare the scenarios with Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda, because either way, the fight for the seat last year almost felt like Liam was getting it no matter what, and that's what we ended up seeing. We also have to remember that Liam getting this seat came at the expense of a driver that a lot of people wanted to stay. And I think it has at least left me questioning whether or not Daniel Ricciardo should have been dropped last year. While Daniel was not necessarily performing where they wanted him to be, the question that I would ask if I had any sort of ability to ask questions at Red Bull in a scenario of what if, is knowing what they know now, would they have dropped Daniel, or would they have promoted Daniel to that second seat and maybe left Liam in the V-Carb? That ultimately doesn't necessarily mean it was the best decision, given that would have meant Isaac wouldn't be in V-Carb right now, and I think Isaac has been performing very well. But looking at Red Bull's camp, they did burn through a number of drivers that they had in their back pocket. This Red Bull stable, which used to feel so big, given the fact that they have two teams and they have so many drivers kind of waiting in the wings, now really feels like it's shrinking more and more every day. And with rumors that Max could leave at any moment, and again, those are always going to be considered rumors until there is any sort of concrete proof, there is really the question of if Max leaves, whether that's because he wants to retire, whether that's because he does want to go to a different team, what does the Red Bull driver lineup really look like? Because right now you've got Yuki getting comfortable, but you also have all of the other things that we've talked about when it comes to Yuki and Red Bull. The Honda relationship is ending, his contract is ending, and there's a question of whether or not they would keep him on. And then you have Isaac Hadjar, who is performing very well, but again, this has only been his 5th race in Formula One. And then you have Liam Lawson, who isn't really performing great. So again, what if? But if Max were to leave at the end of this season and go to a different team, who becomes that lead driver? Who steps up? And did they burn through drivers that could have been in those positions and kept the team going for the next generation? It's something that I think about a lot, especially when we look at kind of what's happened with Mercedes, because as much as people, myself included, were frustrated with the way that the Lewis situation ended and the way that it felt like it was kind of coming up because Toto was thinking too far ahead and trying to bring in that next generation driver, if we're being honest, we can see that they actually have a plan for the future. George Russell is performing, I think, far better than most people expected him to be this season. Kimi Antonelli is being nurtured in a strong way by the team. He's been given Valtteri Bottas as the sort of mentor figure who's helping him learn the ropes. We're seeing the team give him support where they need to, and we're seeing the results come from that. And yeah, George's contract is over at the end of this season, but they have these strong options, and they have a young driver that they're kind of building up to be a very strong driver for the future. So if they had been able to keep things the way that they wanted, if Lewis had stayed on for one more season, once they made that shift, one of the things that they have really needed to prepare for is the idea of Lewis ultimately retiring. Even though that shift happened earlier than they were expecting, they did clearly have the groundwork in place for what happened next. What happens when we ultimately lose our 7-time world champion? Now we know what that plan was. A young rookie, as well as George Russell, who was a driver who was waiting in the wings while Lewis continued to perform. Plus, they bring back some of their old strength in Valtteri, and they're looking at future talent and who comes in next. Plus, they're looking at their other options for George's seat, whether they keep George or they go with someone else. As unfortunate as it is to admit, especially if you are a Lewis Hamilton fan, Mercedes did plan for the future. And as we look at Liam Lawson's kind of performance, the question really is, what is Red Bull's plan for the future in a similar capacity? And where do they find that next driver that fits in when Max ultimately leaves? Whether that's retiring or whether that's moving to a different team. And I hate to harp on it, but I do want to make the point that I think that they believed Liam Lawson was that person. The way we were seeing him spoken about, the way we were seeing testing going, and the things that they were willing to excuse when it came to choices that he made last year really pointed to this idea that they believed Liam Lawson was that next person. They dropped one of their most well-loved drivers and a driver who had a very long history with the team in Daniel Ricciardo and a very strong contender for that second seat with Max because of how well they worked together. They moved Liam in last season without actually letting Daniel finish the season out because they want to get him as much experience as they can. They give Liam that second seat at Red Bull instead of considering Yuki Tsunoda, and then we see him kind of fall apart under the pressure. So as much as they leaned into Liam, I think we're also seeing them pivot away, and the question really is, what is the future of Red Bull if not Liam Lawson? But as always, it's always good to remember that it's only the 5th race of the season. Liam has only had a couple of races with V-Carb as he's moved back in, and you never know, there could be a week off, we could see him really perform in Miami, and we could see him really figure things out. And I hope for both his sake and Red Bull's sake he does, because I think I was actually pretty excited about Liam coming onto the grid last year, and I would actually love to see him shift into focus and really bring out that potential that I know he has. I know that we've seen it from him previously. I think hopefully one weekend away from the track we see him kind of lock back in, but I don't want to hope against hope if we don't really see that happening. However, someone who actually has really locked in and gives us our next race story is Carlos Sainz at Williams. This race for Williams was really good. We saw Carlos performing very well and Alex moving through the grid to come right behind him. Ultimately, they ended up finishing 8th and 9th, and I want to point out some great strategy that you may not have caught on the broadcast just because it was happening more towards the midfield. The way that they cemented keeping both of those cars in those positions was actually a great strategy move. Carlos had the pace to keep pushing, but there was a large gap between Carlos and the next car, and so it wasn't likely that he necessarily would have caught the next car. However, what was likely was that Alex was going to end up in a battle with Isaac. As Isaac continued to approach, we saw a great amount of teamwork from the Williams cars. Carlos actually kind of managed his pace instead of speeding up and allowed Alex to actually get within DRS of him. And so with that, they were able to hold out those last few laps with Alex in DRS of Carlos, which kept Isaac from getting close enough to be able to catch and pass him. Something that I've really been enjoying watching is the way that Williams is settling into their new kind of position. The car has obviously improved since last year. They obviously felt like they got the steal of the season when they got Carlos for their seat, and something we have seen even from the beginning when Carlos was not performing at the highest level is teamwork between these two drivers. When Carlos DNF'd in Australia, he actually jumped on Alex's pit wall. I know we talked about this during the Australia race recap, but I wanted to point it out again because I think it shows how clearly the team is sort of gelling. Carlos in that race actually helped the strategy team make a decision on when Alex should change tires, and that decision ultimately helped Alex finish the race as well as he did. And then today we see them also communicate back and forth very clearly. Do you want me to push? Do you want me to wait? And then ultimately he does wait, and he does hold Alex in that DRS chain. I think when we talk about Formula One, a lot of times it's easy to forget that this is a team sport. As much as everyone is focused on the drivers' championships and drivers are individuals competing, it's important to remember that winning the drivers' championship actually has no monetary value to a team. The constructors' title is where we see all of the benefits to a team come from winning. So last year, when Max won the drivers' title, but they did not win constructors, all of the benefits that they typically would have from winning, they didn't get. As much as we want to focus on drivers, and I think a lot of the flash comes from focusing on the drivers' championship, the real focus of every team is winning the constructors' championship first. That same focus is where some of the tension even started at McLaren to begin with. A drivers' championship is great, but the most important thing is winning constructors. And sometimes that means you do have to work with your teammate. And so we are seeing that with Williams, which I think is part of why we're also seeing Williams move into this steady best of the rest position. Currently, they are 5th in the constructor standings, putting them at that top section of the best of the rest. Obviously, Formula One has this sort of situation where we always have kind of chunks of performance. At the top 4, you're going to have these top teams that are really fighting for the title. Then in the middle, you have these teams that are kind of fighting for that best of the rest section. And then in the end, you have teams that are really struggling. Williams actually has a 5-point lead on Haas. And while we're not going to see them suddenly jump into that top 4 contender for constructors title, it's important to remember that every place at constructors is millions of dollars. And so if we can continue to see Williams perform, we can continue to see the drivers be willing to work with each other, and we can continue to see the car improve, I think Williams has a very strong slot for themselves in that mid-sector. But there are also things that Williams could work on. One of the things we've been hearing from Alex's side of the garage is very tense radio messages between Alex and the team. Alex has honestly been coming in hot the last 2 weeks, and we heard a little snippet of that radio message this week. He was told to kind of watch the heat of the driver in front of him, which was his teammate, essentially being told to give him a little bit of space so that he could protect his tires and the cooling of his car. But Alex kind of snapped back and said, "Did you forget that there was a car behind me?" One thing I thought was interesting was that in the post-show of F1 TV, James Vowles was actually asked about this by Laurel Winter. She asked if this is kind of the typical way that Alex speaks or if there was something really kind of not great going on. And James was actually pretty on Alex's side there, which I think is what a good team principal should do. He said basically that he believes that they could be helping Alex more than they are. His point was he couldn't see behind him. He knew that he had Isaac closing in, and he wasn't told what the gap to Isaac behind him was, as well as how much space he had to kind of slow down. So being told to slow down, but knowing you have someone kind of hunting you from behind can be a point of tension when you can't make a quick decision. Basically, James talked about this idea of not giving clear data and not giving enough data to Alex at that time. And so I do think that there is this situation where we are only getting snippets and we're going, oh, Alex is such a diva, a drama queen. But it genuinely sounds like they're still kind of adjusting to being a team that's this competitive. And that might mean that there are going to be growing pains as they talk about communication and how they move forward. But I would say that it's really interesting to see how Williams has adjusted so quickly to being competitive. Yes, there are bumps in the road. Yes, there are problems that we're seeing. Last week was definitely not a great week for them, but we're seeing them recover quickly from disappointment, and we're seeing them work together and make good strategy calls. The car itself is performing very well, and these drivers are really both starting to gel with it and with each other. And I do wonder how much of this was spurred by last season when they finally got a taste of being competitive when they brought Franco Colapinto on. And there were these moments where like both drivers were doing well. I wonder how much of that was necessary for the team at Williams as a whole to say, hey, we actually could be a competitive team if we really put our minds to it. Because obviously everyone's competing in Formula One because they want to be competitive. But sometimes when you have a slog of losing that runs as long as this one did for Williams, even just a taste of remembering what it's like to be closer to the winner's side might be enough to spur the next season for you. And that really feels like what's happening at Williams. It's nice to see them settling in because I think we've had a lot of conversation last season about sort of the tone change that we've seen from the team, from James as he was trying to get Carlos signed, the shift in the way that things were being spoken about and who would be leading the team, and this kind of change of sort of family energy that we were seeing saying before, it seems like they are settling into their new culture now. And it's kind of not only nice to see, but exciting to see where they'll go next. So if we're kind of talking about team winners of this race, I actually would put Williams on that winner's side. It was nice to see the way that they're working together and how strong they're becoming. Outside of the top, we have a kind of scary moment between Gabriel Bortoleto and Fernando Alonso, where they very narrowly avoid a big crash, and only because of Fernando's experience and quick reaction time. Now, one of the reasons why this kind of became memeable and funny was obviously they luckily didn't crash, and also because in a weird kind of question of sort of like what's allowed and what's not in this sport, sort of conflicts of interest, I guess, Fernando Alonso is also Gabriel Bortoleto's manager. And this is obviously the only kind of relationship we have on track where one driver is managing another and they're also actively competing against each other. And it came out after the race that they would be flying together because of that manager relationship. And Fernando made a small joke saying that Gabriel would not be getting a meal on the flight. I will say that those moments actually do remind me from time to time that even though Fernando is not performing very well this season, there are these little moments where you just see the difference between a rookie and an extremely experienced driver, objectively the most experienced driver on the grid. And so I do kind of like seeing those racecraft moments where it's just such a close call that you actually really get to see someone avoid tragedy to some degree. Then we have to talk about Lando, because Lando Norris had a very strong race. Despite his hiccups of qualifying, we really see him move from 10th all the way up to 4th. And there was a potential for him to finish even higher, I think. We did see him extend his first stint on the hard tires, and we saw him continuing to kind of build that gap and hopefully be able to go in and change tires. But there was a moment where we did see a little bit of kind of lack of teamwork from the McLaren side, as Lando was lapping in front, trying to continue extending that stint, build that gap, and then give himself a little less work to do when it came to coming back out of the garage after his pit stop. Oscar starts to complain about dirty air when being told that they'd like to leave Lando out for Lando's strategy. And I think what's interesting about that is it didn't really seem like the type of situation that would have actually cost Oscar a win to allow them to continue that strategy. But to some degree, it does seem like there's this continued tension between Lando and Oscar when it comes to making decisions for the other strategy, even if it doesn't necessarily affect their own. Oscar was complaining about dirty air with about 3 seconds in between him and Lando. And it did seem like more of a call that he didn't want Lando's race strategy prioritized against his own, which of course, when it looks like you're going to win a race, why would you want that done? Especially when that race means that you are going to become the leader in the Drivers' Championship. However, it did make me wonder how much of this lingering tension from last year is spilling over into this year, and if it will ultimately cost McLaren in the end. Because for them to win Constructors last year, we did have to see teamwork from both of these drivers and sacrifices for their own race for their teammates. And it ultimately did end in them winning that Constructors' Championship, though Lando did not win the Drivers' Championship. And I think it is interesting to see when these moments of kind of tension come up, where I wonder if we hadn't had as much of a confusing situation last year, if they would actually be taking these questions and these scenarios as more teamwork moments. If Oscar felt like he didn't really sacrifice his season last year, or that Lando wasn't prioritized over him last year, or if there wasn't this constant question of if Lando is the first driver or not, would Oscar have been more willing to kind of help open that gap between him and Max, and then ultimately help Lando make it onto the podium and have a double podium finish for McLaren? I do think that there's a possibility that, yeah, they could have used Oscar's help and they could have actually gotten both cars onto the podium had that been the case. But very quickly after that complaint was made, we see them box Lando and move him in, which ultimately results in Oscar having clean air and running away at the front. And then ultimately we do see Lando actually move his way up back through the crowd. But on his way there, he does get a sort of DRS 101 lesson from 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton. This was actually one of the most hilarious parts of the race to me, because we see Lando make this move twice in a row. Essentially what happens is Lando comes up and makes the pass just before the DRS detection point, which then allows Lewis to be within 1 second at that DRS detection point, get DRS for the DRS zone, and then just immediately take that position back. This happens twice in a row until Lando actually understands and then does not make that pass too early, waits so that he himself is in the kind of DRS zone before the DRS detection point, and then is able to overtake with DRS. While he does ultimately make the move and then continue to move through the field, it obviously did take him some time because he was caught behind Lewis for longer. And once he does pass Lewis, he does make quick work of getting right behind Charles Leclerc in the position to be able to kind of move forward. But then because he does not have this tire delta, because Charles Leclerc himself also extended his first stint, and because we actually saw Charles Leclerc have strong tire management and strategy from his side of the garage for once, we actually see Charles Leclerc be able to completely hold off off Lando and keep that gap until the end of the race. This marks the first podium for Ferrari, which is very exciting if you are a Ferrari fan, but is also very exciting even if you aren't, because it shows that this race we actually had 4 different teams kind of in contention with at least one car. Obviously, we end up having Oscar win this race from McLaren, and we see Lando actually have a great race despite how far back he started. Then, even though we see George Russell fall behind, we did see him have high qualifying pace, and he did still finish in the top 10. Then, obviously, we have a Ferrari from Charles Leclerc in the mix, and of course, Max Verstappen with a Red Bull finishes second. So across the board now, we have a number of teams kind of in contention in this race, and hopefully for the rest of the season. And then a couple of other things just to finish out the race. Lewis has to get stronger from the start of the weekend. We keep seeing these moments where he does actually have a decent enough race, and he does make good moves in the race itself, but he just can't seem to get that pace in qualifying, and it feels like he's always starting on the back foot. And qualifying with Mercedes last year was also a kind of weak point for him. We saw him out-qualified by his teammate a number of times last year, and we're seeing that kind of trend continue here. And it shows a little bit more this week because we saw Charles Leclerc have such a great performance. So the question is, are we moving towards a better car and we just need Lewis to adjust? Or does Charles Leclerc still have something on this car that he expects more than Lewis expects from his? There are a number of different possibilities, but it really does come down to the fact that we need to see Lewis actually perform from start to finish through a weekend. And it's hard because we are still kind of hearing some defeat in Lewis. Last week when he was asked about fans hoping for something different, he said don't. And this week we also saw him say that the rest of the year is going to be like this, it's going to be painful. We know that he is adjusting, we know that he's trying to figure it out, but it is a little disappointing to see. I did kind of expect this year to be a bumpy road for Lewis overall, because moving to a team that has a completely different power unit, a completely different car, a completely different team, especially when he has been so used to being with the same team and the same engineer for so long with Mercedes. I think it's going to be a long adjustment period, and I do think I said that last year, and I'm hopeful that by the end of the season he does get his footing and he figures things out, preferably before the end of the season, and that we will see kind of a performance change next year from him. That being said, obviously, like every other Lewis fan, I would love for that to change sooner rather than later. But ultimately, I think the highlight of this race is really seeing this idea of McLaren dominance not be the same type of dominance that we've seen before. This time last year, when we were looking at Red Bull, it was this conversation of who would finish second to Max no matter what. There was never a question that Max was going to win the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship until we got to Miami and we started to see things shift. We've referred to the Red Bull as this rocket ship that can't be beat, especially with Max Verstappen behind the wheel. And so one of the things I wanted to look at comparing last season to this season is that at this point last year, we were still in that Red Bull dominant period. Max had actually won every single race except for Australia. In Australia, he didn't win due to brake failure and having to retire the car. Additionally, his gaps were massive. He won that first race by over 20 seconds, and his smallest gap to second was still 12.5 seconds. And while we are seeing a McLaren dominant period right now, they absolutely have the fastest car on track, and they have 2 strong drivers behind the wheel, and so their point spread does feel quite big. We also are seeing a real amount of competition from behind them. Max Verstappen himself is still very much in the running on the Drivers' Championship side, and again, we're only 5 races in, anybody could win, but we're not seeing one driver win every single race. We have seen Oscar officially take his 3rd for the season, which is a big deal as he is the only driver to win multiple races this season so far, but they're not running away with these wins. And I do think ultimately that is a better type of competition for this sport. As much as it was exciting for Max to be as good as he is and for the Red Bull to be as dominant as it was, and that's still a really big feat in this sport, it's not as exciting to watch. And so even though we are in a dominant period where we're seeing McLaren win for sure and be this faster car, we are still seeing them fight for it. Like we said earlier, Max took a 5-second penalty, but Oscar didn't win this race by over 5 seconds. It was actually less than 5 seconds in the gap. And while penalties that are served during the race don't automatically add up to, oh, it would have been 5 seconds shorter of a race, he would have been 5 seconds faster, there is this point that those 5 seconds did make a large difference to Oscar actually winning the race in the end. And so with that being the case, we've also seen strong performances from George Russell, and now today we actually see a strong performance from Charles Leclerc in a Ferrari. What is very exciting is that we are absolutely shaping up to see strong performances and fights across the grid. Williams is performing very well, but right behind them is Haas, and we saw a really strong drive from Ollie Behrman recently, and then again we're seeing strong performances from Pierre Gasly other than the crash. For me, this race really highlighted that even though we feel like we're in this dominant period for McLaren, that dominance is not actually as big as it seems. We're still getting really exciting and close racing, and this really still could be a season won by anyone, both on the driver's side and the constructor side. And it will be interesting to see how things shape up at Miami, because as this kind of confidence starts to build across multiple teams, and as we continue to have a fight in the middle, which makes things a little bit more tense throughout the race, I hope we continue to see these types of races where things are so competitive and so close, and that it's a fight for both championships all the way to the very end. So overall, I think the race itself is pointing to a very great rest of the season. A couple of highlights from after the race, we have Max very clearly fuming, refusing to answer a question from DC about that gap and that penalty, and in the press conference essentially saying that he can't speak his mind because he doesn't want to get in trouble with the FIA. And I think this battle between Max continues on. We also had Christian Horner literally print out a picture of Max's car at the apex, arguing with reporters that he was clearly ahead and that the penalty wasn't fair. And I think these are things that you're always going to see from teams. They're always going to back their drivers and they're always going to say that they believe they were in the right. But it is one of those scenarios where it's clear that they were not going to make a change. But I think it's also clear that Max believed he would have won that race had it not been for the penalty. And I think for Max, the thing is when you have a champion that then gets kind of humbled and isn't able to win, has been struggling with the car, and then suddenly gets a win at Suzuka. Any win that feels like it's being taken away from you, whether that's the truth or not, is going to hurt a little bit more and you're going to be a little bit more intense about it. Depends on how you look at the penalty, depends on which picture printed out you believe, but I do think that tension between Max and the press was very clearly because of the FIA and his energy there. Then I will say one of the funniest post-race press conference moments that we saw was Alex Albon being told about the penalty by a reporter because he revealed that he was flying home with Max and the reporter let him know that it may not be the most pleasant of flights. Once Alex was explained what the penalty was, he said, "Yeah, I think I'll just go to sleep on the plane." And then we also have this kind of split between Oscar and Lando and the way that they're talking about the car. Lando has been saying that he doesn't feel that they actually do have the fastest car and that he feels like it is not a lock-in for them. They still have to fight for this championship. They still have to be focused and someone could turn around and take it from them. He pointed out the fact that we saw multiple cars matching them in pace in qualifying and that it's not this lay-down situation that everyone seems to think it is. On the flip side, you have Oscar very clearly happy with his win, happy with the fact that it's his third win, and saying that he does believe they have the fastest car. Very clearly, there are two different camps here, but I will say there's kind of a truth to both of what they're saying. Oscar is right. They do have the fastest car, and obviously he has been able to benefit from that. But Lando's right as well in that they are not running away with this title, and that they do have to stay focused and not begin to believe that it's theirs to lose, but that they have to fight to maintain that win. It will, again, be interesting to see how this moves forward as they continue to race. If Lando locks back in, has strong qualifying pace, but also what upgrade packages we continue to see brought by other teams. If these other cars start to improve and McLaren does not improve at the same rate, that fastest car scenario goes away. And then it really comes down to driver capabilities. And it'll be interesting to see which of the two drivers perform based off of what we actually see in these upgrade packages and how competitive the other cars get. So that pretty much wraps up the race itself. Let's get into your questions and then your hot takes and predictions. Okay, a number of questions that I got were actually specifically about that 5-second penalty versus the 10-second penalty that Liam got for the same infraction later on in the race. If you were confused by the fact that Max only got 5 seconds and Liam got 10 seconds, but it was the same infraction, it's totally okay. The answer seems kind of silly when you look at it. Essentially, the answer is at what point of the race these penalties happened. Max's penalty was received because of an incident on the very first lap, where drivers are actually given a little bit more leniency on track limits and these types of moves. Liam's infraction happened later in the race, not during that kind of period of leniency. And so because of that, they still give Max a penalty. They don't let him get off scot-free, but they halved that penalty from what it typically would be and only gave him a 5-second penalty. Liam's penalty was actually in line with what they typically would give for this type of issue and what they gave previously last year. So it's literally just a question of the fact that they know the beginning of the race is quite chaotic. Drivers are giving a little bit more leniency at that time. And so the best thing that they could do was sort of still penalize Max, but not penalize him to the harshest extent. Was Yuki at fault for the crash with Gasly? I would say that this was just a racing incident. I wouldn't ascribe fault to either of them necessarily in a strong way. And given the fact that nobody was given a penalty, the FIA kind of feels the same. What does Max need to do from here in order to secure his 5th world title? Is there still hope? Yeah, absolutely, there's still hope. I think the car is on the upswing. I think Yuki has proven himself to be a futurely strong teammate, if that makes sense. And the more that we see him improve, the more that he'll be able to support Max in that bid. And if the car continues on the path that it is, I think Max is going to be back in contention for winning races, just like we saw he was today. So not to simplify your answer, but what Max needs to do is win, and he needs to start doing so strongly and soon. Is Alonso's seat at risk? Is Max likely to switch? I would say not this season, but I would say the question for 2026 is a possible one. Max moving to Aston Martin would make a lot of sense to me. Adrian Newey is there, as well as Honda is moving over, and parts of Max's dominance come from the car that was built by those two people, or that partnership, I guess, Adrian Newey and Honda. Plus, there's obviously an extreme amount of money available at Aston Martin, and Fernando Alonso has really struggled to perform this season. The question for Fernando is going to become whether or not he wants to continue his his legacy in this way? Does he want to finish out continuing to kind of be at the bottom of the grid despite the fact that he was a 2-time world champion? Or does he kind of come to the point where he says, this is the end, I don't want to tarnish my legacy, and retires at the end of this season? If that is the case, obviously you then have a team that has one of the best engineers in the business, a very good power unit supplier, and a lot of money to be invested because of their owner, Lawrence Stroll. The question becomes, if Fernando does retire, does Max feel enticed by that? And I think that ultimately will come down to how Red Bull ends up finishing this season out. Are they able to turn around and become a team that Max believes he can win another title with? Or does he believe if he stays with Red Bull, he's kind of done? That will be a question that I don't think we have enough answers right now to figure out, especially because we're seeing improved performance from Red Bull. But I do think never say never. Everything is always a possibility in this sport. And contracts kind of mean very little. They kept talking about bad air in relation to car performance. What does it mean? I think this question is about kind of dirty air, which we did hear referenced a lot during this race. Essentially, the longer that you are running close to a car in front of you, the more heat is coming off the car in front of you and affecting yours. You're going to have worse tire degradation, meaning that your tires are going to last less time, and your car itself kind of struggles to cool down. So you need to be able to get into what we call clean air, just meaning that there's space between you and the car in front of you so that you can cool down your tires and cool down the car as a whole. The longer that you are in dirty air, the worse your tires are for the race itself, and the more heat your car has, and sort of the performance continues to go down. Especially in a race like this where it's already hot outside, it's never great to be running in that dirty air. And moving on to hot takes and predictions, Charles Leclerc deserved driver of the day. I actually think this would have been an interesting choice. The driver of the day situation has been kind of weird the last 2 weeks, and I think Charles Leclerc had a great race. I also think Lando would have been a contender for how much he was able to move through the field, and from the back of the field, I think we could have seen an Isaac Hadjar or a Carlos situation. All of those feel like drivers that I could have gotten behind a driver of the day. Next one, we've got a prediction of Lando does better while Piastri leads the championship, stays consistent in the championship. I'm not totally sure which one we're talking about being consistent, but I do actually agree that I think Lando performs better when he feels like he's under pressure from someone else. We saw this strong performance from him last year, and I think he has talked a lot about Oscar actually making him a better driver. And while we have seen 2 rough weeks from him for different positions, this race itself really did show that when he's under the gun, he is able to perform. The question will just really be, can he come back out of this kind of fog that he's been in the last 2 weeks and qualify better in Miami? Personally, it would be really cool to see him repeat the win at Miami back to back, and I will be there, so I would love to see it. But I do think Lando, yes, does perform a little bit better under pressure, and I think Oscar himself is having a couple of good strategies. So it'll be interesting to see how they do, but yes, I do think they'll hopefully both perform well in this championship run. That pretty much wraps up the hot takes and questions that we had for this race, and I will say that I'm hopeful that Miami will continue to be a strong, fun race. Last year, it ended up being a really fun time, and it was really exciting to see the upgrade packages that were brought, and it'll be interesting to see if we see any different performance from these cars as we move to a different track and a different environment. If you will be at Miami, I would love to know because I will be there, and I'm hoping to see if we should do some sort of kind of meetup or something like that. And in case we do, please make sure that you are following me on social media at Marissa Kumari on all platforms. That's Instagram, that's TikTok, that's Threads, that's YouTube. Any meetup we do, I'm going to make sure that I announce it on all of those platforms so that you guys are able to meet up with me if you're in Miami. And as well, make sure you join our Discord server. That's a great place for you to not only ask questions that are ultimately included in the podcast, but you can also watch the races alongside us. We have people from all over the world inside the Discord chat. We talk about the races while they're happening, which is great if you normally watch races alone, but we also ask questions, keep up on the news, and of course, that's where I will actually check in to make sure we can have a meetup. So until next episode, make sure you're following me on all platforms, and be sure to join the Discord server using the link in the episode description. And I'll see you soon.